There was conversation about insufficient coordination and sometimes too much competition. I said that wrong. Insufficient and ineffective outreach and coordination, as well as fragmented collaboration and coordination. We need to unlock the opportunities on the landscape and work better together. There's infrastructure constraints that require strategic action and focus. We need to monitor more and track our progress more effectively so we all know what we're shooting for and how much progress we've made. And there was a discussion about a mismatch between sometimes what the restoration actions are doing and the actual life history needs. We created a menu of 26 potential actions. Again, these haven't been decided on, and the point is not to read them to you, and I won't. But if we roll up some key action areas, there are 5 that I'll say here. One venue for potential updates is the Upper Columbia Prioritization Framework. It's a really robust framework. I think the updates, if they were pursued, could focus on transparency, adaptability, and making sure that we're aligning biological priorities with our actions. I think we need to improve the accounting of our restoration progress and needs. Sponsors report metrics. Metrics often get rolled up into rosy numbers, but we often don't get to see how much progress is being made relative to some target or relative to what's available. Funding process improvements. We recognize that funding for sponsors takes a lot of effort. We also recognize that the funding systems in place incentivize certain types of projects. And sometimes it felt that the discussion centered around a risk aversion component. How can we change our scoring in funding processes to incentivize collaboration and innovation? We definitely need strategic coordination and planning around integrated multi-benefit projects, particularly in lower river corridors where there's infrastructure, landowners, and a lot of complexity. And then there was discussion about streamlining and refining the governance structures that we work within, including, for instance, the watershed action teams. How can we use those governance structures, those groups, to coordinate projects, do bigger projects, more impactful projects? So that's the institutional barrier part. I'm going to shift a little bit towards that yellow square, the habitat methods. What are some themes that we heard? Climate change is a common discussion, and generally I think we're pretty good at describing the impacts. Here are some maps showing temperature and flow impacts using some readily available data sets. But we really need a strategy. How do you restore watersheds with a specific climate change objective in mind? And it sounds complicated, but restoration is a tool to ameliorate some of those climate impacts, and it also adds resilience to salmon. So I think we could have a strategy that's formed on some basic ideas. What do you do on the landscape? What are the restoration actions? Where do you do them? And then how do those actions either add resilience to salmon or ameliorate climate change impacts? The latter might be planting trees to prevent warming. Those two are not mutually exclusive, but using a simple framework can help us organize our restoration actions on the landscape to address climate impacts. I'll say that there's some really good literature by Beachy et al. From 2023 and 2013 that outlines some of these ideas and a lot more. We've learned a lot about floodplain restoration. It's become increasingly a focus in the restoration world. I think we have some opportunities, however. Stage 0 still has not been implemented in the region as far as I know. There's an opportunity to do that, not because stage 0 is the only approach, but because we can expand our toolkit. I think there's a need to understand how much do these projects cost, not only initially, but over long term. We talk about low tech, big wood, stage 0. All those have an initial investment, and they pay off in different ways over time. Some take more adaptive management, less. How do we think about life cycle costs and the investments we're making in our watersheds? We want to integrate food webs. There's been a lot of great work in the region on that. And then a big part of doing floodplain restoration is streamlining the floodplain permitting project. That's a direct negative feedback on the work and the benefits we're seeking. And then lastly, I think it helps to organize what we're doing in some broad buckets of the landscape. And we've just been calling these the upper watersheds and the lower watersheds. And they really have different problems of scale and need for how we approach restoration. We just did a stream order analysis, and we said how many miles are in order 1 through 3 versus stream orders 4 through 6. And there's a big, naturally you'd expect, there's over 5,000 stream miles in the upper watershed category, and about a tenth of that in the lower watershed category. Smaller streams, bigger rivers. And then ownership differences are hugely different, of course. Upper watersheds are largely Forest Service owned. Lower watersheds are privately owned. They have a lot of infrastructure. How do we treat those places differently? I think of the upper watersheds as places where we're not opportunity limited, we're really capacity limited. There's a lot of places to restore, but we need to streamline those efforts so we're maximizing. Maybe it's more of a focus on quantity than quality. So cost-effective techniques, that's not just that we're going to put BDAs in streams. It's thinking about how do we implement these projects. Let's think about the supply chain of low-tech work. We need to streamline coordination with the Forest Service and clarify what are the downstream benefits of these projects. In the lower watersheds, how much do we need to do to be effective and impact fish? I think there's some questions about the value of restoration in lower rivers. These are clearly places where infrastructure and people come into play, and we need multiple and diverse funding sources and plans to create multi-benefit opportunities. It's a different story. Projects are harder. We need to focus on creating the opportunities to do meaningful work. So, summary of opportunities, this is high level. We have an opportunity to unlock progress through streamlining of how we work together. I'm not saying we have to blow up the system, but I think we've identified tweaks in the system that could lead to meaningful improvements in pace, scale, and effectiveness. And then within habitat restoration, there are opportunities to make it more climate focused, catered to the community and the landscape position, and then just more broadly community focused, so we're engaging a broader set of interests. And just to highlight once more the next steps, the summary report will be coming out, I believe, this winter, and then phase 2 should commence this year as well, involving decision making and all H integration. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And with that, we have reached our final speaker of the day. So please welcome David Duvall from Grant PUD. He'll be closing out our session, and then we'll invite all the speakers back up for our final Q&A.
Thank you and good afternoon. Give yourself a pat on the back for staying until the end of our meeting today. I better figure out how this thing works before I get too much farther. There we go. So I'd like to start out by saying I'm appreciative of being here and being able to work on this program now for going on close to 25 years. And if you're here to hear a repeat of the talk we just heard from a different perspective as outlined in the agenda, I've got bad news for you. I'm not going to be talking about that. If you want to hit the exit, now's your chance. Otherwise, you're going to hear about no net impact. A little bit of a add-on from what we heard earlier from Ross. And no net impact from a definition of, from the perspective of a hydro group, may be a little bit different. I'm sure most of you have heard a little bit about this term. We're going to talk a little bit about it from the perspective, from a hydro development perspective. I like this scale as it outlines a little bit of what we're trying to accomplish here. We're trying to reach a balance with knowing that we're going to have some fish loss due to hydro development operations, and we've heard a lot about mortality through pisciferous and avian aspects. If we don't have anything to keep that balance in line, it's going to bottom out, and we're going to have a lot of mortality. So due to the documents that we have in place to help us meet those NNI goals, which I'll talk about a bit more, we have some tools in our quiver to help us keep that balance intact. And the mitigation that goes along with the loss, at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the year, at the end of the decade, we hope and strive that we will achieve a balance that will work for everyone. This here is a little bit of an outline on what you're going to expect to see over the next 10 or 12 minutes. And again, NNI has a suite of tools that can be used to help meet that mitigation that we have. As mentioned, there are requirements to achieve certain survival requirements. In this case, we're going to be talking about Okanagan Sockeye. As they migrate down through the system and pass through these dams, we have to achieve a certain level of survival to make this thing work. The next one we're going to talk a little bit about is hatchery supplementation, how that can be helpful, how that can help restore and reintroduce previously blocked areas with sockeye salmon. Next, habitat restoration. We just heard a lot of projects that can be implemented. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the ones that we've been able to accomplish. And finally, we've also heard a lot about adaptive management, what that means, how we can apply that. So Chelan and Douglas PUDs, they have, as mentioned, habitat conservation plans. Within those plans contain the framework, the recipes within the cookbook on what we can do, how we can apply these tools, what can be achieved. As far as Grant PUD, we have a little bit of a different document. It's a salmon and steelhead settlement agreement. And again, it contains the information and the recipes on what needs to be done in order for us to achieve that balance that we're looking for. More specifically, the first and foremost perhaps might be the adult survival as they pass downstream through the dams. The idea there is to achieve a 91% survival rate for those, in this case, again, juvenile sockeye smolts. How can we achieve that? What needs to be done? A second tool in our in our quiver is essentially a compensation through hatchery supplementation. And we've applied a number here, we meaning a large collective group of 7%, to try to make up for some of that loss, that unavoidable loss that occurs through hydro development operations. And finally, making up the last 2% compensation through tributary restoration projects that we've heard about, and we're going to hear a bit more. You've already seen this side. I'm glad that our numbers matched. So Chelan PUD conducted survival studies for 3 years and essentially took tags, put them in fish, released them into the reservoir, and watched them survive as they passed downstream. And in order to meet those survival standards, and both at Rocky Reach and Rock Island, they had rates of over 93%. And this allowed them to achieve their survival standards for main stem dam passage of sockeye salmon. Likewise, Grant PUD had our own survival studies, and again, for 3 years at Priest Rapids and Wanapum Dam, fish were collected, tagged, released into, in this case, the tail race of Rock Island, were tracked as they migrated downstream through Wanapum, through Priest Rapids, and then continued on down into the Hanford Reach. And through the dams or the concrete survival, when they came up to Wanapum, they survived at various rates, but generally upwards of mid to 90%. Same with Priest Rapids. Now these rates show only, on this slide, show only the fish that survived through the concrete. During the same study, those fish that were tagged and detected again down in the Hanford Reach, those fish survived at a 91.7%. So they experienced all the different mortalities associated, piscivorous and avian predation that we've heard much about. The important thing is, in this case, Grant PUD also met the survival standards to continue with meeting NNI. The next tool we have is hatchery supplementation, and about the same time as we're trying to find opportunities for hatchery supplementation, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, a First Nations group in Canada, I will refer to them as ONA, they were looking for potential rearing lakes to put hatchery fry for their reintroduction program. And they chose Sockeye Lake, which is upstream of Osoyoos. And in this instance, it was above a couple of different barriers, but they proceeded anyway. And using a facility in the Fraser system called the Shuswap River, for almost a decade, they were able to produce hatchery fry for their reintroduction program. At the same time, Chelan and Grant PUD were helping them and also helping us to meet our mitigation needs through these hatchery supplementation program. That temporary facility that was already existing was kind of a short-term stopgap until a new hatchery could be built. In 2014, the partnership between Chelan, Grant, and ONA were able to build a new hatchery facility specifically designed for sockeye supplementation. And this next graph here, the idea is to show let me see if this works. I don't know if it's going to work on the screen. So this here was the outplants from that existing facility, and typically it ranged from about 300,000 to maybe 1.5 million smolts on an annual basis for about 10 years. Those fish were released into Sockeye Lake as part of their reintroduction program, as well as the Osoyoos Lake for some comparative analyses and studies. 2014, the new hatchery came on board, continued to release fish into Sockeye. On even years, we were able to collect, for the new broodstock collection program, quite a bit more, I guess, fry to be released into those lakes. So you can see the increase was substantial from previous years, and in some years we collected up to about 5 million smolts. Also, the green bars there represent fish that were released into Lake Okanagan, which was the grand prize that all of us were looking to achieve at some point in the future. And within a couple years, through some dedication, determination by ONA, we were able to fast track and get fish released into Okanagan Lake through ceremonial releases and other mechanisms. This next graph shows a 40-year history, I guess, up until the reintroduction program started in 2003. You can see from the early 1960s through the early 2000s, the escapement of sockeye into the Okanagan Basin lingered less than 100,000 fish per year. And again, in 2003, ONA implemented a variety of mechanisms, including hatchery supplementation, some habitat restoration projects. In this time frame here, where these blue arrows are, if you will, there was probably a dozen or so habitat restoration projects that were used to open up barriers and provide spawning gravel and a suite of other activities that allowed what we think a substantial increase in the returns. And as mentioned last year at this conference, also Douglas PUD offered up a fish water management tool. And if you want more information on that, there's a poster over there. You can get all the information you want. I guess the take-home message from this is through these restoration efforts, through high survival of main stem dam passage and hatchery supplementation, we really think that a lot of these fish were able to return to the Okanagan. In 2024, we saw a near record return, if you will, of over, I guess, 750,000 adult fish counted at Bonneville Dam. Of those fish, about 75% were of Okanagan system origin, and the Wenatchee also provides a fair number as well to the Upper Columbia. Through a monitoring and evaluation program operated by ONA, up until this point for about 10 or 15 years, the proportion of hatchery origin fish on the spawning grounds made up about 7 to 10% on any given year, which was okay, but not great. We'd like to have it be higher than that, but that's what we sampled. In 2024, a PBT analysis using fin clips from DNA sources allowed the estimation, I shouldn't say it allowed it, but how do I put that? The return of hatchery fish to the Okanagan based on these PBD samples was actually found out to be more like 20%, which was great news for the hatchery staff. They really felt like they were providing a lot more input into the reintroduction program. Moving on to the next quiver, the 2% that corresponds with the supplementation for habitat restoration. Here's kind of my sales pitch. The previous talked about some Blue Dot sponsors. If you folks are out there and aren't tapping into these habitat funds for your restoration projects, you need to reach out to us and make sure that you're getting your fair share. We can't fast track permits. We can't really do much with weather constraints or bureaucracy, but there is funds available for sponsors to use to take action on restoring some of these habitats. As you've seen this list here, Chelan and Douglas PUDs have their separate accounts, part of their HCP. You can see 117 projects were done through these funding agencies. Grant PUD has a similar program. 166 projects have been completed over the last 20 years. You can see the dollar amounts are available that have been allocated for restoration projects. $17 million for the Rocky Reach and Rock Island Trib Committee, and almost $38 million for the PRCC. I wanted to talk a little bit about adaptive management, and we've heard that term quite a bit today. In 2025, we were able to trap and haul over 100 adults from the Wells Dam. Appreciate Douglas PUD for making that available to us. This was in reference to trying to make sure that we could collect broodstock on years when the returns might be low or environmental conditions might prove difficult to do. Happy to report that we We did collect and transport those fish. They did make their way into the broodstock program. It was a low return. They made up 100,000 eggs that supplemented the normal broodstock collection by ONA. Finally, another adaptive management plan is to, since the hatchery is 12 years old now, we want to rebuild that, expand it out from the current capacity of 5 million to 8 million eggs. We're in the works of doing that in certain years like 2016 and 2024. We might be able to increase the egg capacity once the hatchery is expanded. Last slide. Gosh, it's been great to work with this program. I think you could argue that the Sockeye returns to the Okanagan is probably as good a success story as you can find on the whole West Coast over the last decade or 15 years. I'm glad to have been able to be a small part of that. I think that if we can continue to meet high dam passage survival rates, continue hatchery expansion, and release those fish into areas that were previously blocked, we can continue to see these runs prosper into the future, even though we're seeing signs of climate change that's certainly going to affect us all. Thank you.
All right, so I'd like to invite all of our speakers up to our Q&A, and we'll have 2 mic runners again, so please raise your hand if you have a question.
I'm coming.
Renee, if I go to your project site, do you have details about the public participation parts of the project? Because that's something that I'm really interested in.
We do, and also I'm happy to just talk to you about that and unpack it, so you can find me and we can set up time for a conversation. But we definitely have a few reports, and there's one, I'm trying to remember if we have a separate one just on phase 2, but we certainly have one that's like who participated, but just in terms of how we structured the outreach, and we structured it differently at different places, and how we got people to just come to the meetings. You know, like for example, one of the strategies we used was we had Barry Tom, when he was the head of NOAA for the West, and one of the really senior people from the water side, and sometimes one of the kind of well-known NGO folks, when we would do outreach meetings, all come. And so then people were like, oh, this is supported by all of these important folks from these different constituencies. It seems like something we should pay attention to, until they had enough experience of the process that they felt like it was worthy of their time on its own. So anyway, I'm happy to talk about those flavors of detail.
No more questions? Oh, there was one. Okay, good.
Hey, my question is for Renee, I think. I am wondering, I really like the premise of your talk, so thank you for that. I'm wondering about how, when you're in a room with stakeholders from kind of representing different interests, one of the things I've noticed is a lot of times their interests function on different time scales. So a lot of times in ecology and fish management, we're thinking about ecological and evolutionary time scales rather than kind of the profit within a quarter or you're maintaining your employees or whatever it is that the stakeholder is thinking about. So how did you go about reconciling that difference in time that people are thinking about?
That is a super astute and fantastic question. And I'll say that, we did it with more or less success in certain cases. So I think there's kind of two ways that we did it. One of them was by internalizing the belief that the only way that this would move forward successfully was led by a coalition of the willing, so that we couldn't force people to participate or make it mandatory or tell everybody it was the most important thing. And part of that is that, I think, to just editorialize a little bit, that there's like a flavor of trauma that most of us probably experience in some way from the gaslighting that is the difference between the way the world operates and what we feel on the inside. And when you ask people to do something different, they're taking a risk and they're being vulnerable. And so there's a trade-off between, is it worth my energy, even if what I'm doing right now isn't serving me? Like, even if I'm in the corner getting wailed on in this boxing match, at least the corner is known and it has walls. If I go out in there into the open space, like, who knows what could happen, and it could be worse. And so you're just like being aware that we were inviting people into a circumstance where we might not have a felt experience of what they were risking. And then when people communicated either in words or by their actions that they weren't up for that stretch, just letting that be and continuing to just show up with them and continue to offer engagement and solicit their engagement and keep them updated, but not, be like, well, you're going to miss your opportunity to participate. It's like, no, we hope that you will come be part of the dialogue. And also there's no guarantees that this is going to lead to anything. We tried to be realistic about our objectives along the way. Like, initially our objective when we created the recovery definition that I said to this whole group of scientists was, I just mainly want us to have a different experience of working together. And if we have that, I will consider this a success. And other people might not consider it a success, and I will deal with their wrath. But I'm hoping that we can just feel differently. And I'll just say, one of the prime examples of the question that you raised was, we had 3 consecutive years of commercial fishing closures, and this work happened in the middle of that. And the commercial fishermen did participate, but they were really reticent to, because they were basically like, we don't care about long-term planning. We're trying to figure out how we're going to pay for our boats and feed our families, and if this federal check is ever going to show up to help us out. And we were just sort of like, that makes sense. And we also feel like we share the same interests as you, and we don't know how we get you to a place where all those unused permits get used again if we don't do something differently. And so we're working on the doing differently part, and we'd love it for you to be present as much as you can. So sort of a long-winded answer, but that's like the feeling of how we navigated it. And it was tricky, and it continues to be.
Anything else? Well, thank you everyone for staying to the end, and thank you so much to our speakers in our last session. Let's give them a hand.
And just a few quick announcements before we get started on our poster session / social hour. So just to clarify about the badges, only drop them off in the basket if you're done with us. So if you're coming back tomorrow, please keep those badges. We don't want to rehand those out to you tomorrow. So social hour / poster session is sponsored by Wolf Water Resources. So appreciated them paying for the beer and the bartender. Again, concurrent poster session. You can see the 6 posters, really interesting posters over there. So please engage with the poster presenters. I find personally I have more meaningful dialogue during poster sessions. So yeah, poster presenters will be there. Definitely reach out to them. Our bartender is Keisha. I hope I'm saying your name right, Keisha. There, she's back there. If you feel so led, leave her a tip. We got 2 kegs, so there's plenty of beer. We all had a moment of like, are we actually going to finish it? So do me proud, drink responsibly, but let's see if we can finish those. But yeah, drink responsibly. Keep your red cup. We're all environmentally conscious, so we only have like 240 or so. So please, if you're going to have a second one, keep your red cup. There is non-alcoholic options. There's cans of sparkling water that Keisha will be handing out as well. We also have some food out from today, so if you're hungry, we have some of the leftover food. So please, afternoon donuts are wonderful. And then, we'll do a drawing around 5 p.m. So we'll have a mic. We'll randomly draw for a few items that we'll be doing that to add to the fun. So anyway, thanks again, and enjoy the social hour / poster session.